Imagine having so much power that your decisions could determine life or death, not just for one person, but for an entire movement that would spread across the world. Annas and Caiaphas were two such men. They weren't kings or warriors, but priests, guardians of the temple in Jerusalem. Yet their actions led to one of the most famous and tragic events in history, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. It all starts in ancient Jerusalem, a city buzzing with tension. The Roman Empire ruled over the Jewish people, and the priests, like Annas and Caiaphas, acted as middlemen. They held a delicate balance of power, keeping the peace between the Jewish people and their Roman rulers. But their influence wasn't just political, it was spiritual. They controlled the temple, where people came to worship God, offer sacrifices, and seek guidance. Annas had been high priest before, and even though Caiaphas officially held the title now, Annas was still the real power behind the scenes. Together, they ran the temple like a family business, passing down control from father to son. At first, Jesus was just a traveling preacher. He didn't seem like a threat. But as he went from town to town, healing the sick and performing miracles, something incredible began to happen. Crowds started to follow him. His words instilled hope in those disregarded by the powerful. Jesus spoke about love, forgiveness, and the coming of God's kingdom. And with every miracle, his influence grew stronger. Jewish tradition envisioned the Messiah as a king who would liberate the Jewish people from their oppressors. And that scared the priests. If Jesus continued to grow in popularity, it could lead to a rebellion. The Romans might crush the Jewish people, and Annas and Caiaphas would lose everything they had worked so hard to maintain. They saw Jesus as a threat, not just to their political power, but to their entire way of life. What would happen if people stopped coming to the temple and started following Jesus instead? What if the Romans heard that a new king was rising and destroyed their city? They couldn't confront Jesus directly in front of the crowds. He was too popular, and doing so would cause an uproar. So they began to meet in secret, plotting how to arrest him without causing a scene. They needed to make Jesus seem like a criminal, a rebel who was a danger to both their people and the Romans. And they knew just the right people to help them. Judas, one of Jesus' own disciples, who would betray him for a handful of silver. They arrested Jesus at night without a defense. What followed was one of the most unfair trials in history. They brought in false witnesses, twisted his words, and eventually found a way to accuse him of blasphemy, the worst crime imaginable. Their determination was to permanently silence Jesus. But what they didn't realize was that by plotting against Jesus, they were setting themselves up for their own tragic downfall. They would lose the very power they sought to defend, and history would remember them not as great priests, but as the men who betrayed the Son of God. To understand their story, we need to go back to the early 1st century AD, when Jerusalem was under the iron grip of the Roman Empire. The Roman authorities ruled with an unforgiving hand, but they allowed local religious leaders like Annas and Caiaphas to maintain control over the Jewish population. This fragile partnership between the Jewish leaders and the Roman rulers was key to keeping the peace. Any disturbance, any hint of rebellion could result in Rome unleashing its full force on Jerusalem. Annas and Caiaphas knew this well, and it terrified them. Annas was a former high priest, appointed in AD 6 by the Roman governor. Despite his official removal from his role in AD 15, his influence persisted. He continued to hold power behind the scenes, pulling strings through his sons and his son-in-law Caiaphas, who became high priest around AD 18 and held the position until AD 36. This was an unusually long time to serve as a high priest, showing just how powerful their family had become. They dominated the religious and political landscape of Jerusalem for decades. At first, Jesus seemed like just another preacher, but as his teachings gained popularity, they began to see him as a direct threat. Jesus was drawing thousands of crowds, performing miracles, healing the sick, and speaking about a new kingdom, the kingdom of God. And that's where the real danger lay. The term kingdom suggested political change, something that could attract the attention of the Romans. In a society where any talk of rebellion could lead to Roman crackdowns, they were deeply afraid. What if the people started to believe that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah who would overthrow Roman rule? Caiaphas, in particular, knew the consequences of any political instability. The Romans would punish Jerusalem severely, and he, as the high priest, would bear the consequences. Jesus wasn't just a religious problem, he was a political danger. They stood to lose a great deal. Maintaining peace with the Romans was crucial for their families' wealth, power, and influence. They had seen how quickly the Romans could destroy everything in their path. There was no room for mistakes. Fear can drive people to do unthinkable things. Annas and Caiaphas weren't just afraid of losing power, they were terrified of the chaos that could follow if Jesus' influence continued to grow. They knew that the people were starting to look at Jesus not only as a teacher, but as a savior, someone who could free them from oppression. For them, this wasn't just about religion, it was about survival. The Passover festival was fast approaching, and with it came the possibility of unrest. Jerusalem would be filled with pilgrims from around the world, and Jesus was at his peak. His triumphal entry into Jerusalem, where people welcomed him as a king, was the final straw. They knew they had to act fast before the crowds got out of control. If the Romans saw Jesus as a revolutionary figure, it could lead to the total destruction of everything they had worked to maintain. In John 11:50, Caiaphas famously said, "It is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." This moment marked their decision to eliminate Jesus. They convinced themselves that sacrificing him was the only way to protect the nation from Roman wrath. But fear, the fear of losing everything they had built, drove their decision. In secret meetings, Annas and Caiaphas plotted to arrest Jesus without causing an uproar. They needed to move quickly and quietly before the crowds could rise up in his defense. Their plan was simple. They would accuse him of blasphemy and present him as a dangerous revolutionary to the Romans. They struck a deal with Judas, one of Jesus' disciples, to betray him. Judas agreed to lead them to Jesus under the cover of night, when the crowds wouldn't be around to protect him. Everything was in place for their secret plan to unfold. But what they didn't realize was that their plan would have consequences far beyond what they could imagine. They believed they were helping their nation, but they were actually destroying themselves. By choosing to sacrifice Jesus, they thought they could maintain their control and keep the peace with the Romans. But their actions set in motion events that would not only destroy their influence, but change the course of history forever. They may have silenced Jesus for a moment, but they couldn't stop the movement that followed. What they feared the most, the loss of power, was exactly what happened. Their story is a powerful reminder that fear can lead people to make devastating decisions. After months of tension and plotting, Annas and Caiaphas were ready to take action against Jesus. His teachings had become too popular, his miracles too powerful, and his message too dangerous. They had to stop him, but they couldn't do it in broad daylight. Jesus had too many followers. If they arrested him in front of the crowds, there would be an uproar. They needed a way to capture him quietly, under the cover of night. Enter Judas Iscariot, one of Jesus' 12 disciples. Judas had been with Jesus from the beginning, witnessing his miracles, hearing his teachings, and walking by his side. But something changed inside Judas. Whether it was greed, fear, or doubt, Judas chose to betray the man he had followed for so long. Annas and Caiaphas needed someone on the inside, and Judas was willing to sell his loyalty for 30 pieces of silver, the price of betrayal. Once they arrested Jesus, they wasted no time. They couldn't afford to delay. The Passover festival was underway, and they needed to act quickly before Jesus' supporters could rally. But there was a problem. Jesus hadn't committed any crimes. Annas and Caiaphas knew this. They needed to invent accusations, manipulate the law to their advantage, and guarantee Jesus' condemnation. The trial of Jesus wasn't fair, it was a sham from the start. Jewish law dictated that trials should occur during the day, involving witnesses who could confirm the charges. However, they tried Jesus at night, in secret, and without any legitimate witnesses. Instead, they brought in false testimony, people who claimed that Jesus had threatened to destroy the temple and that he had spoken blasphemy by declaring himself the Son of God. Even with their lies, the case against Jesus was shaky. The witnesses contradicted each other, and none of their accusations could stick. But Annas and Caiaphas didn't care about justice. They were determined to see Jesus convicted, no matter the cost. When they couldn't find a solid crime, Caiaphas asked Jesus directly, "Are you the Christ, the Son of God?" Jesus replied with the truth, "I am." That was all Caiaphas needed. He tore his robes and declared Jesus guilty of blasphemy, a crime that under Jewish law was punishable by death. But there was another problem. The Jewish leaders didn't have the authority to execute anyone. They needed the Romans to carry out the sentence, so they dragged Jesus before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, accusing him not only of blasphemy, but of claiming to be a king, a challenge to Roman rule. Annas and Caiaphas had twisted the law, manipulated witnesses, and falsely accused an innocent man. It all boiled down to fear. They feared Jesus' influence over the people. They feared losing their power and the fragile balance they maintained with the Roman authorities. And so they sacrificed justice for the sake of their own survival. In a way, their actions reflect a deeper, universal truth. When fear takes control, it can lead people to do things they never thought possible. Annas and Caiaphas didn't start out wanting to destroy an innocent man. They didn't set out to betray their faith or their principles, but once they allowed fear to dictate their decisions, the line between right and wrong blurred. They persuaded themselves that the preservation of their authority justified the sacrifice of one man. History has a way of teaching lessons that echo through time. This story of two of the most powerful priests in ancient Jerusalem is no different. In order to maintain authority, they betrayed their faith and the principles they were supposed to uphold. Their decisions set in motion events that would not only change the world, but would also seal their own tragic fate. The crucifixion may have given them control, but the tide was turning. The death and resurrection of Jesus ignited an unstoppable movement. What they thought would end with his crucifixion only gained more momentum. His followers grew in number and in faith, spreading his teachings far beyond the borders of Jerusalem. The very man they had condemned became a symbol of hope and salvation, while their names became synonymous with betrayal and injustice. If you're finding value in this story and learning more about the incredible journey of Annas, Caiaphas, and Jesus, consider showing your support with a super thanks. By doing so, you're helping us continue creating engaging and meaningful content, bringing important historical and spiritual lessons to life. In AD 36, the Roman governor Vitellius removed Caiaphas from his position as high priest. The once mighty family dynasty of Annas and Caiaphas, which had dominated Jewish religious life for decades, began to crumble. The grip they had held over Jerusalem weakened, and with it, their influence faded into obscurity. Caiaphas and his family reportedly faced exile or disgrace shortly after his removal from power, but the specifics of their deaths are still unknown. However, one thing is clear. The priests who conspired to end Jesus' life were unable to escape the weight of their actions. Fear, ambition, and a desire to preserve their own status at all costs brought them down. There is a powerful irony in the fate of Annas and Caiaphas. In trying to eliminate a man they saw as a threat to their power, they ultimately destroyed themselves. Their story serves as a reminder of how fear can cloud judgment, leading people to make decisions that have far-reaching and often tragic consequences. They believed that sacrificing Jesus would protect them from the wrath of Rome, keep the peace, and preserve their hold over the temple. But the exact opposite occurred. Jesus' death and resurrection became the foundation of Christianity, a movement that would spread across the Roman Empire and in time reshape the world. What Annas and Caiaphas feared most, losing their authority, became their reality as the message of Jesus continued to grow in strength and influence. This story is filled with important lessons about power, fear, and the choices we make. They remind us that when we act out of fear, when we let our ambition cloud our sense of justice, we risk not only harming others, but also destroying ourselves.